we'll get started then. People are still coming in, but I'll just do my opening spiel and then we can get into the real interesting stuff on today's webinar. So welcome everyone to the latest ESCoE webinar. My name's Mary Spowage. I've been involved with ESCoE for a long time and I'm on the ESCoE Leadership Executive. I'm a professor in the Economics Department at Strathclyde University. And I'll be chairing today's webinar. We're going to hear in a minute from our speaker, Cher, who's going to talk a bit about the research on standards development and technology and how that can impact on businesses. And I think it's a very interesting topic and very topical given what's going on at the moment in the world. But just before that, just a bit of housekeeping. We do have some time for questions at the end, so we're going to hear from Cher and then from our discussant John Morrow, and giving his thoughts on the research. But we do have time for questions, so please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box. Don't wait till the end. You know, if something occurs to you, please put it in, and then depending on how much time we've got at the end, I'll either put the questions to Cher and maybe John as well, or you know, ask you to unmute and ask your question yourself. So please don't be shy and ask any questions you have of our speakers today. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Cher, who's going to talk for maybe sort of 30-40 minutes on the research before we hear from John and his thoughts. Cher.
Thanks very much, Marie. Thanks. And let me just share my screen now.
That looks good, Cher.
Thanks. Brilliant. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much, everyone. And so thanks for joining me here today. I'm also really excited to share this research on how firms gain power in global production networks by engaging in technology standards development. I will explain a little bit more later as we go along what I mean by standards development. And first of all, I'm also joined here today by my brilliant co-authors, Xingden from Manchester Business School, Alliance Manchester Business School, and John Moffat from Durham University Business School, who I'm sure will jump in for the discussion later. So now, before we get into the details, let me start with the question, why do standards matter? So these might, when you hear the word standards, this might mean different things to different people. Some of you might think of quality management systems or accounting standards, or some of you might even think about the red tape. So I know. So standards perhaps don't exactly scream excitement, but let me take you back here to 1904, when the lack of a simple standard actually turned a small fire into a disaster. So let me open with this case of the Great Baltimore Fire. Picture this in the US state of Maryland in February 1904. A small fire broke out in the dry goods store. The local fire department jumped into action, doing everything they could to contain it. But the fire spread fast, and it got so bad that the firefighters from the neighboring Washington, Philadelphia, and New York were all called in to help. Over 1,000 firefighters arrived, ready to battle the flames. But there's a huge problem. Their hoses didn't actually fit the Baltimore's fire hydrant. So at that time in the US, they had over 600 different hose coupling sizes. Without the standard, the incoming firefighters couldn't really connect the hoses to the hydrants. So the result, 17 city blocks destroyed, 1,500 buildings were reduced to rubble, and 2,500 businesses wiped out. So this disaster really made one thing clear: the lack of standards can have catastrophic consequences, which is what brought us to this Baltimore standard. A year later, when the National Fire Protection Association set a national Firehose standard, which specify a 2.5-inch connection with the 7.5 threads per inch, if you like the details. And so this is the Baltimore standard, which is still in use today. Of course, this wasn't just about fire safety. It was also about compatibility, efficiency, and ensuring that the systems work together. And let's fast forward to today. We may not be fighting fires, but standards are everywhere and they're ubiquitous, especially in our digital economy. If I do a quick thought experiment and by asking you how many standards are there in a laptop that many of us use today to join this webinar, if you're thinking about a few dozens and you're wrong, okay, so the answer is at least 250. That's just the compatibility standards in order to enable different parts to talk to each other, and not accounting for the other software protocols for the internet to work or the other environmental quality standards that many of these manufacturers have to comply with. Okay, so modern days. So let's talk about maybe the standards in the modern digital economy. And since Marie mentioned how topical things are these days. So if I start with this well-known Chinese saying that pretty much captures the role of standards perfectly. The Chinese say third-tier companies make products, second-tier companies make technology, first-tier companies make standards. Why? Because products come and go and technologies evolve. But standards really shape entire industries and having ripple effects and throughout the value and production chain as well. And major firms understand this. So take Microsoft, for example. They don't just build software, and they actively shape global technology standards. So Microsoft's corporate standards lead, well, they have many of their senior executives chairing various standards committees. So as one of their standards lead, Jason Matuso, puts it, and we cannot ignore that we have to apply global standards to get the maximum benefits based on responsible use of AI technology. As a platform provider, successful us is when the economic benefit to our customers collectively dwarfs the economic benefits to our business. And the work of SC42, so this is one of the ISO's, so ISO International Standards Organization's Standards Committee 42, that's very influential now in developing AI standards. So that will be an important enabler for marketplace expansion in which every organization can participate and benefit. So as you can see, this isn't just about compliance, it's about influence. By setting standards, firms shape the direction of industries, dictate how technology is adopted, and position themselves at the center of the global production networks. So the question we really ask in this study is, does participating in standardization, so this business-led participation and behavior, actually improve their standing in their global value chains? So let's look at the Microsoft example again, how this plays out in practice using the data we have on the Microsoft global suppliers and customer networks within the AI ecosystem. Okay, so here what you see is the Microsoft's AI-related supply chain in 2015 on the left, and 2023 so on the right. So this juxtaposition really helps highlight how much their network has expanded within that 9 years, with much stronger links now to the US, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And so the thicker the arrows are and the more central their position is in their networks. So as you can see that the thicker arrow indicates they are growing their centrality as well. So Microsoft has definitely deepened their global integration in the AI space, especially downstream. If you look at where the arrows go, so it's pointing more towards the downstream with their customers. So with them as a key supplier in technologies and in the key regions they operate. So what's driving this shift? of course, the Q is in the title of the talk today. So the factor we focus on here is a standardization. As we know, Microsoft has been actively involved in AI-related standards development, ensuring that their technologies really become deeply embedded in the global AI ecosystem there. Okay, so and hopefully by this point, I don't need to convince you even more why standards matter for firms. And just to quickly summarize, then they really ensure interoperability. If you think about the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and 5G, and these are the standards we're talking about. And they also reduce uncertainty. So the firms know what technology to develop, how they build their product that is aligned with those technology standards. And the standards also shape competition. Especially the ones we are looking at here, they are the so-called de jure standards, as opposed to de facto standards, which are emerging through the market-based competition. So these de jure standards are essentially developed by those public organizations or the industry consortia, so anyone can use them. And this kind of open nature really enables companies to compete in the market rather than for the market. In other words, it saves them from having to fight over which technology becomes the market standards, as in the de facto standardization case. So as I mentioned earlier, our focus is on those standards development organizations, SDOs, in the ICT area. So these are the formal bodies that coordinate the global standards development in those technology areas. And so the question we ask is, does participating in SDOs help firms become more central in their global production networks? And here we study this by unpacking the suppliers network as well as the customers networks. And we also try to shed light on the asymmetry by looking at different global regions as well. So who are those organizations that coordinate the creation of standards? And so in our analysis, we look at 176 of those. So these are just some examples here. Some of the key SDOs include IEEE, and many of you have heard of that. And so that IEEE is responsible for the Wi-Fi and semiconductor standards, as well as some of the emerging AI standards as well. And W3C, which governs the web standards, so that really governs how our internet, the whole web functions. On the academic literature side, so here we particularly build on two key frameworks to answer our research question. The first one is the global production networks, and that has been quite well investigated in the economic geography literature, which really highlights the firm linkages across industries and regions. And another literature that many of our economists are perhaps more familiar with is a global value chain literature that we use here to help us really understand how value is created and distributed globally. And here, our main hypotheses are that the SDO participation enhances a firm's position through three mechanisms here. And the first one is through licensing, and that really particularly applies to firms that are more upstream, who are the technology developers. So here, firms can help create standards that would enable them to embed their technologies in those standards. So by advocating for the inclusion of their often proprietary technologies in standards, those companies can create dependencies on their solutions. They can then secure a revenue stream through licensing further down the line. And the second channel is through the early mover advantage. So companies can anticipate regulatory changes if they are active members in those organizations. They can then align their research and development with the future standards, and therefore giving them a competitive advantage. And that applies to both the upstream and downstream firms. So not only limiting to the technology developers, but also the downstream product manufacturers as well. So they can anticipate what the future technology look like, and they can, factor in those technology specifications in the way they develop their products. And lastly is that knowledge spillovers or the network externalities argument, in that the members of those SDOs can gain access to valuable industry insights, and they can collaborate with others and learn from best practices there. Okay. So how do we actually measure the firm's position in their global production networks, and to measure our standards and participation behavior? And we really assemble sort of multiple data sets to track firms' position within these networks. The first one is the fact set Revere. So that's a data set which gives us information on the production networks, including the supply chain linkages of companies dating back to 2003. It helps us identify those firm level connections. We're not really looking at the inter-country or inter-industry level connection, but it's a firm-to-firm connections here. The data company compiled the data through the regulatory filings of those companies and the press release and many other disclosures in public that would give us that insights into those suppliers and customer relationships. And then we also bring in financial information from the company-side CRISP database. I should have said that our focal sample here is the US companies. So we use some of these well-established financial databases to construct the data of the linkages for our publicly listed US companies. We use Obis IP to and construct patent data, which can give us some measures of the innovation capacity of those companies. And finally, and importantly, the standards membership data we use comes from Sales Centers database, which is the center based at Northwestern University in Chicago. The Sales Center data helps track the membership in those 117 different SDOs I talked about between the 1996 and 2014. So this pretty much covers the totality of all the SDOs that are active in developing ICT standards. So we can see that by covering these SDO and their memberships, that give us pretty much the universe of the ICT standardization efforts in the world. And we also further select our industries based on the percentage of firms who are actually members of these SDOs to ensure that standardization is actually relevant for those industries. And in terms of the core variables we calculate to measure how connected the firms are, we very much draw on the network-based approach, where our core variable is this degree centrality. So essentially that provides an overall measure of how many direct connections a firm has within its network, which is then normalized by the size of network in order to make this comparable. And like I said earlier, we want to unpack this centrality, which gives us an idea of the influence or the power of the company within their network. We want to look at this by breaking this down into both the more upstream suppliers network as well as the downstream customers network. So we then have the in-degree centrality that measures more upstream. So that sort of is pretty much from a supplier point of view. So you sort of go further sort of upwards in towards supplier, and then you have the out-degree centrality that measures the further downstream of the customers network. So we also use a bunch of other centrality measures that are well established in network analysis for robustness checks, which measures indirect linkages. But we don't really do this for the main analysis, but I'll show you some of those results using indirect connections that or some other measures that factor in the influence of your connected partners, etc. So we use some of these established measures from that network and literature. And then because global networks are not evenly distributed, in most of our analysis, we further disaggregate and this down by region to see whether SDO participation has different effects across North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. So now let's move to the methodology part, and so I can show you how we test those relationships. So it's a very simple baseline model, and that allow us to answer, does joining the SDO lead to statistically significant increase in firm centrality? So our dependent variable is these different measures of centrality. On our right-hand side, we have the SDO participation, which is a dummy variable indicating whether a firm is a member of any SDO in a particular year. And then we then control for firm characteristics, including their assets and their patents count, and their financial information and industry trends. And we then further control for the firm and year fixed effects. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the kind of connections, I know a lot of you like some visualization. And so here is a map of the normalized R-degree centrality by country, illustrating in this case, it's the downstream customer linkages. So again, well, this is for on all the countries here, and so that can provide some ideas into how firms engage in SDOs are actually integrated into different markets. So here, the top part is the sort of centrality or the connections for the non-SDO members. And the bottom map shows the connections of SDO members. As you can tell that, again, the US firms really maintain very strong customer networks across Europe, Asia Pacific, and beyond. And there is a major difference in the pattern between the members and non-members. Now, moving to the suppliers network, let's put your pattern recognition skills to the test. Can you spot the difference? So this is the customer, and this is the suppliers. Customers, suppliers, sorry, it's like an eyesight test. So at first glance, you can see the sort of suppliers network map looks quite similar, but notice how some regions appear slightly more muted in color. So this indicates that the suppliers linkages, in other words, these are the in-degree centralities, tend to be weaker than the customer networks we just saw. I think this gives us some initial indication that firms engaging in SDOs are actually more focused on expanding their downstream customer base rather than reconfiguring their suppliers network. I will show you some other more perhaps robust regression results to reinforce some of these earlier descriptive pictures we have seen. So here, again, I talked about symmetry across geography. So here we really want to plot the customer supplier relationships across different regions in the world. So, and as you can see here, in this heat map, it sort of uses the means of supplier customer links in each country. Sorry, in each region that we are looking at here, and in those 6 regions. So in the vertical dimension, we're looking at the suppliers and the customers' location, and across the horizontal dimension, and that is the focal firm's location. And so, of course, the diagonal line should be showing you the connection within individual regions, which obviously will be the strongest one, as you would imagine. But across the board, I think some of the key takeaway is that, sorry, I should say obviously it's a heat map, so the darker the color is, the stronger the connections are. So clearly there's much stronger linkages in our global north, and North America and Europe really dominate, with very high intra-region supplier customer ties as well. Especially the top right corner, you can see 10.22 is the average links within North America. Asia Pacific is well integrated compared with some other parts, but really largely as a supplier to lead firms in the global north. And again, the on the contrary, if you look at the global south, there's much weaker connectivity here. Africa, Latin America, and the Mid East have very fragmented production networks. And the Africa's strongest ties are, according to this heat map, are with North America. That's 4.07, rather than within its own region. So here, these are some of the results. I think we probably have to go back and probe a little bit more whether this is actually showing genuine Africans' dependence on external value chains, or whether that's more of an artifact of this particular data source, which perhaps is compiled based on available information, and that could well be a lot more US centric, or maybe sort of global North centric, just simply because there is more information available for companies operating in the global North. Of course, this heat map doesn't necessarily show the role of standards, but we can easily sort of anticipate or have some hypothesis on how standards might reinforce this already quite stark contrast between different regions, or these kind of patterns. So standards are essentially developed by lead firms in global North, giving them a first mover advantage. Many of the firms in the emerging markets are often standards followers, so they adopt rather than define standards, which again further limit their influence. And without active engagement in SDOs, these kind of disparities will perhaps persist. Okay, so what do our results show? Let's go to our core findings. So in our main regression results, as you can see, I've just kept a very simple result without showing you the the more elaborate version with all the controls variables included in. But simply you can say that the SDO participation has a small, excuse me, but statistically significant effect on a firm's degree centrality. So that's the overall degree in terms of total number of connections, as well as the out degree centrality. So that is in their customers' networks. However, the impact on the in-degree centrality in their suppliers' network is much smaller and is actually not statistically significant, again suggesting that the firms might use SDOs more for the market access rather than supply chain restructuring. And in terms of the marginal effects, and the SDO participation is estimated to increase the shares of firm connection by 0.01 percentage points. And that is equivalent to about 1.8 connections based on our data, which isn't huge, but is still meaningful. Like I said earlier, that we threw in a bunch of other centrality measures to extend beyond these direct connections, and by looking at does our results still hold, and if we look at if we account for both the direct and indirect connections, giving more weight to the firms connected to the more influential nodes. And so first of all, we have this eigenvector centrality, which captures the firm's influence by considering how central its connections are. So if you are connected to the key players, you matter more. And secondly, we have this Katz-Bonasici centrality, which is similar to the eigenvector centrality, but applies a decay factor, meaning that the closer connections matter more than the more distant ones. We then have the hub centrality, which then identifies firms that act as major distributors in a network. So if a firm supplies more key players and it scores high on this dimension. And we then have the last authority centrality, which measures how important a firm is as a target of these inbound connections. And so that's ideal for firms that attract significant demand from others. Like I said, these are all relatively established measures in the network analysis literature. So across the board, as you can see, that our results really still hold. In terms of the geographic breakdown, so where does the SDO participation has the strongest effect? We again observe observed quite positive and statistically significant effects in both the US and foreign markets for those focal US companies. And the influence in the foreign markets seemed to be especially driven by the impact among European customers. So that really shows the strength of the US and European ties there. Again, as you can see, the impact is stronger in the customers' markets as opposed to the suppliers' markets. And we then further ask the question, does this impact depend on some other firm level factors? To explore this firm level heterogeneity, we examine particularly a firm's patenting intensity. In other words, does it depend on how innovative a company is? And the simple answer is yes. So firms with high patent intensity sees a significant increase in both the overall and their out degree centrality when they engage in SDOs. And then we look at some other contingencies based on the features of the SDOs. Okay, so, and here we look at do all standards create, or do all the SDOs have similar impact? So here we break the SDOs into based on their focus of their activities into these technology-centric SDO versus market-centric SDOs. So in other words, just like firms, SDOs also have their business model, if you like. Some technology-focused SDOs focus on developing the early technologies like the AI, for instance, or the 5G right now, which is developed by 3GPP for these mobile networks. Then you have some other more market-facing SDOs that are focused on the adoption of the technologies developed elsewhere or promoting those technologies developed elsewhere, or they specialize in the certification of the products, etc. So then we can have two kinds of SDOs. And here, so the first row here, the SDO is the technology-oriented SDO, and the second row in my table here, we are looking at the market-oriented SDO. And so the key takeaway here is that the participants in the technology-oriented SDO, so that first row, really have stronger centrality in their customers' market. And in the second row, the market-oriented SDOs seem to have a strongest effect on the suppliers' network. So the takeaway here is that I think the alignment between a firm's business model and which foreign or which SDO they go to develop standards is really important. And furthermore, we then look at when it comes to membership, is it the case that the more the merrier? So we look at, in other words, this intensive marginal participation. So here, the effects seem to be really largely confined to the initial participation in developing standards. So once you've participated in any SDO at all, whether you have membership in 3, 5 or more SDOs does not actually significantly enhance your centrality further. So in other words, this the initial effect is really strong and the results may not be linear. As most of you will already be thinking, how do you address the endogenous bias potentially, in the sense that the firms that then join SDOs may already be more central in, or may already be more influential in their production networks, which might make it difficult to isolate the causal impact of the SDO participation. So here, to address those different sources of endogenous bias, and we use the following strategies. The first one is, to make sure results are robust, and to the potential reverse causation, we use the lagged explanatory variables by measuring the SDO participation behavior 1 year or 2 years before we measure the centrality, and the results so still holds. We also use a matched sample by comparing like with like. So we match the SDO firms to some similar non-SDO member firms, and then again, and our estimation uses matched sample. shows that our results are still relatively robust, although the R degree centrality results is gone here, but the overall we still have that. Our final sort of measure our final approach to identification is to use the instrumental variable. And so here, and from the sort of economic sort of game theory literature, we know that firms to standardize or not tend to be a complicated decision, but there is a massive influence by the peer firms. In other words, a firm is more likely to standardize, to adopt industry standards if they see a lot of their peers are already participating in developing standards. So here we sort of try to link into this kind of rationale by coming up with a variable that captures the peers' SDO participation behavior. And the trick is actually very difficult to identify which firms are the relevant peers for a focal company. So here we construct variables showing the number of their industry peers that are SDO members using those two methods to identify peers. The first one is based on a pairwise similarity in the financial statements, and again following other finance scholars' approach in identify peers based on whether these other companies have similar financial statements. And there's also another way of identifying peers by looking at the similarity in the product description from those companies' annual report filings. So based on these two methods, we have used our first stage results and do confirm that the peer participation, irrespective of the measures we use, and they strongly predict a firm's likelihood of joining the SDO. And then moving on to our second stage, the main result using our instrumented variable, again, that does confirm a strong causal effect in that the SDO participation significantly increased our overall degree and our degree centrality as well. So very quickly to wrap up, I think I've said quite a lot about the findings as I went along, but here's what we found, that the SDO participation does increase firm centrality, especially in their customers' networks, and the effect is really much stronger in Europe and Asia Pacific than in other regions. We also found that whether a firm can truly benefit from their participation in SDO also hinges on their patent portfolio. So the ones who have a stronger innovation capacity tend to get more out of their SDO participation or their standardization effort. So here is really a key policy implications, I think, for all countries. That is that there is a case for the government to really try to actively support firms in engaging with international SDOs to really ensure that their businesses have a say in determining how those standards are developed and what those technical specifications look like. And particularly the implication for the emerging market is that, the initiatives like, for instance, China, who has a very strong or growing voice in standardization, and they have a very proactive and standards vision, the standards 2035 strategy. And this kind of strategy could really bolster competitiveness by making good of a disadvantage and those business partners traditionally had, and by encouraging their proactive SDO participation. But these strategies, as we have shown, perhaps work better if that can be tailored to innovative companies that are most likely to benefit from this kind of engagement. Finally, in terms of future avenues, I think we want to really expand our analysis to really look at what's happening in Europe and in the UK, and with the comparison with the Chinese company as well. As I said earlier, so far our focal companies, so the perspective we take is actually from the US companies by looking at their different kind of linkages, and to really truly shed light on this sort of global asymmetries, we probably want to construct different samples there. We also want to perhaps explore the role of SMEs and how they can benefit. And so far, again, the US sample we have is from the listed companies, so they are confined to large firms. And again, they might be useful to assess the longer term impact, or maybe to improve our measure of the standardization efforts. So currently our sort of main variable is a dummy variable to show a membership that could be a little bit crude. And so hence why when we use our IV methods, I think that sort of review, there might be some measurement issues there. But then what we're estimating, I think, is a lower bound of that effect. And we had a more precise measure of how the depth of engagement, which companies are actually contributing to those technical specifications, and by using the meeting records from those participation meetings, or by really getting a better idea of the nature of the membership, whether they are normal observers or do they have voting powers, or what are those companies doing in those SDOs, that would give us much better measure. So I think I will stop there. I'm very happy to join the discussion and take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Cher. Really interesting presentation, and interesting to see evidence about the sort of impact that can be felt by individual companies participating in these things, which I guess for some companies could be seen as benefiting the greater good, but not necessarily them. But that evidence that it does benefit companies to be involved in these things. I'm gonna we have got some questions coming in, which is great. So please put your questions in the Q&A box if you would like to ask Cher or our co-authors any questions. But I'm just going to hand over to Don Morrow now to give his thoughts as a discussant.
Okay, thanks a lot for that really interesting talk. It's really nice to see my ESCoE colleagues again. I know in May we have the ESCoE conference at King's, my former institution. And actually I was just noticing that during that there's a Western themed version of Romeo and Juliet at the Globe. You can get £5 or £10 tickets. So if you're interested in maybe joining for a little social after the conference, we could all enjoy that. So without further ado, let me... Okay, oops, select window or screen. There we go. All right, are we good? Yes. Hold on, there we go, we're good. Okay, we're great. All right, fantastic. So, okay, so this paper, let me just get into it. I won't spend too much time on summarizing it, but what's the big question? Sorry, let me make this. Sorry, let me move this full screen. There we go. Hope we're good. Okay, so what's the big question really? It's kind of saying, can interfirm organizations solve coordination problems, and does this impact their behavior and performance, right? So if you saw the US presidential inauguration, very noticeably, there were a bunch of what are known as tech bros sitting there in Congress instead of some other people that are usually there. And clearly these people have kind of embedded themselves with each other, and also in a kind of organization, in this case, a political organization, to gain some market advantages, make some important connections and things like that. And we've seen some other indications of that. But within a standards organization, there's a lot of things that this can do. It can reduce risks of innovation. It can ensure markets will get return on investment because you know that there's going to be a customer for you. I mean, there's an analogous aspect of this the governments do, which is purchase guarantees, right? They say, look, if you engage in certain activities, we're going to guarantee a market for a certain amount of it so you can recover some of your fixed costs. So I think a bigger question here is that are firms capable of making these similar private commitment devices with each other through these standard organizations, right? We all have the same standard. I'm definitely going to buy some of your parts. They're going to be interoperable. You're going to supply them to me so that I'm not going to have a supply chain or holdup issues, et cetera, right? And the big question here is, can we see those in the data? Can we think of a way to see those in the data? So here, Cher and co-authors look at standards development organizations and buyer-supplier networks, which is a burgeoning literature on that. And there's a lot of things that could be going on, which I won't go through. Cher just talked about a lot of the really interesting implications for SDOs. But one way to frame this is to think is that this is going to encourage spillovers beyond the firm boundary, in particular, information, interoperability, technical standards. So in some sense, it's kind of breaking down one bit of the boundary of the firm. And the key finding, of course, is that firm centrality can increase through this, and it's through the customer base expanding, but surprisingly not through the supplier base. Although in some sense, what's known from a lot of the buyer-seller networks papers is that there's a lot more customers, say, from that data than there usually are suppliers. They just outnumber one versus the other for most firms. So it's a great finding. It gels really nicely with all of the kind of buyer-seller papers that have been coming out, and also with the firm network literature. Okay, so the caveats I'll get into quickly here. My main issue, I guess, is that the paper starts with correlations, and I'd like to push you a little bit more in identification at the end there. We got had like an IV strategy. In particular, I'd like to probably see that moved up earlier in the paper and just say like, look, this is our strong identification idea. What's the main result? Supply chain linkages, firm to firm, are going to expand and along buyer links. It's going to be driven by US and European firms, by patent intensive firms, and not surprisingly by, say, what we consider influential or better linked SDOs. Also, the effect is kind of like one-off. Once you're in, you're in. Okay, so once that's our little picture here, once you've joined the global customer SDO organization, that has the big effect, and additional ones don't do it for you. Okay, so that's really interesting because of lots of implications for M&Es. Because if I'm part of a business group or if a multinational enterprise, and I have a foreign owner, well, then I'm probably already in the club. So I'm already kind of having these benefits. And I guess one way I could push it for some of your extensions is looking at French firm data. There's French business group data. There's things like the Pôle de Competitive, which encourage these kind of collaborations between, in particular, SMEs and bigger firms. They're really aimed at that. And the policy papers I've seen on that show that the impact is on SMEs. Bigger firms tend to already have a lot of the connections and standard organizations, memberships and all this kind of stuff. So they don't get much out of it, but it is these smaller, younger firms and private firms that get advantages from this kind of stuff. Identification, the literature on kind of treatment effects like this has come a long way. A couple papers, Chez Martin and Depuis, can never quite say that right, but there's a couple papers you could run your same estimations with. Basically, the idea of these papers is that over time, these treatment effects might be heterogeneous. So they have ways to correct for that. You've got a bit on like lag solving causality. It wasn't totally clear to me why that's the case, because these are like big firms, they're long, they're forward thinking, all this kind of stuff. It wasn't totally clear to me why a firm wouldn't have it in their strategic vision to join an SDO in 2, 3, 4 years. Unless you could show that the SDO didn't exist, for instance. So that would be one way to think about it. What happens when new SDOs come up and then people join the SDO? So that would prevent this kind of long planning horizon kind of thing, in which case there's another paper you could look at to do that kind of stuff. And I guess the other thing is this idea of this peer competitor IV idea that you're going to look for similar companies and join an SDO with them. Well, I guess what would be nice is if a peer joined an SDO and then you follow suit, because that would give, some kind of more identification, and you could do a placebo test, right? So you could see, am I more likely to join once a peer joins? And then if you change the outcome variable, am I as likely to join the SDO if my peers haven't suddenly joined it? That would give you another test for this kind of stuff. Okay, so I know we want to stay quick here to have time for questions. So I guess I want to thank everybody on these webinars. They've been great. I've hosted a couple. I want to host a third one. And another paper I want to suggest to share is a really recent paper on Turkish robots. Hopefully that's what's coming through on the graphic here, these evil eye robots with fezzes on. But basically, these guys look at imports of robots and the impact across buyer-seller networks, and they look, say, downstream. So they try to see that if your upstream firm adopts a robot, does the downstream firm who buys from them get any kind of productivity boost? They do. Does it depend on the kind of the quality of the robots their upstream partner is getting? It does. And they do some really careful, clever stuff thinking about these buyer supplier networks in terms of identification. It's a really excellent paper. So I would also suggest you maybe check that to think about the kind of identification stuff you can do with these network measures. So I'm looking a lot forward to further developments, and I hope also maybe I can host this Turkish robots paper at a later series at ESCoE.
Thanks very much, John. That's great for those very interesting thoughts. We do have some questions, but Cher, do you just want to give a couple of brief thoughts on John's points there for participants?
Yeah, so I think I agree with them all. So I don't have a particular strong defense on any front. So I think you know it's all excellent points. I guess I would just respond by saying that this is definitely the first paper drawing on this kind of data set. I mean, it's the first time we, as a team, me and my co-authors, used this firm-to-firm connection data. As we made quite a conscious effort to try to deviate from maybe more aggregate industry data. So we wanted to really drill down to the firm level and be able to link this to some other strategic behavior issues. So your suggestion on the French data and any other sources then can allow us to delve a bit deeper in this black box of what's actually happening is really helpful. And we do have a next project in mind, which is to look at the UK companies that would involve us constructing different data sets and potentially, like I said earlier, doing a comparison group with, where there's a lot of actions in the Asia countries, especially a lot of there's a lot of discussion about the standardization strategy of some latecomers from those emerging economies. So that I think that will make a really interesting case. So yeah, I think data would both be an opportunity and a challenge as well in terms of getting those SMEs, especially from those markets as well. So that, but I completely agree with you. I also anticipate that's where you're going to get most bang out of bucks because of the smaller sizes and how the sort of the marginal impact should be much stronger than the large companies there. I agree. The lengths and the matches these are not enough. Perhaps I apologize. You might have been reading a slightly earlier version of the paper where you may not have seen the IV results, and so which I just presented. So I thought I gave you so that was totally my fault. Hopefully you find that rationale convincing. But we can definitely talk a bit more offline. But I want to maybe get my co-authors to help respond to some of the questions posed there. But just a very easy one I can pick, and I'll leave the difficult one to my co-authors. There's a question from Uten about how do you become a member of SDOs, and can you join one? Yes, so anyone can join. Like I said, these are very public organizations and they try to be really open and friendly. So there are a lot of academic members, but usually they are the engineers who contribute to the technical specifications of telecommunication technology or the AI technology. But if you are interested in, let's say, AI ethics, I don't see why you don't try to join. And but I guess the sort of and the deeper question here you're trying to get to is, if this is such a good thing, why aren't all the firms doing this? So really the barrier to this engagement, there is a financial thing, there is also an information barrier. So the financial side actually really depends on the firm size. So you've got a different tier of membership. So the membership is costly, but for academic members, it's not. So it depends on how much power you want to have. You have to pay different fees. So some companies also spend a lot of money in sending their R&D technicians, engineers to represent themselves in this meeting. So this personnel cost is also a big part of that as well. And for us, I think there is a real information barrier for smaller companies. If there could be any sorts of government support to help, pay towards a smaller amount of membership fees or covering the travels, etc., that could probably make a big difference in terms of that kind of intervention. But anyway, so I want to ask if my co-authors want to come in and
because there's another question from a participant about the patent side of it. So essentially, my reading of the question is that different SDOs have different rules about participants disclosing or licensing patents that they have or that are involved in setting the standards. So I think the questioner is sort of saying, is that an area that could be an extension of the research to look at different SDOs and their approach to patenting and the extent to which that changes the relationship or the benefit that firms have in participating. That's what I'm reading the question as, Cher.
Yeah. I'm just seeing this, and it's thanks, Brian. That's a really good question, and 100%. But it will be. I mean, I suppose it's a different string of the literature, where I'm also working on in terms of looking at this licensing issue and this patent policy, and that obviously have got massive links to the competition policy, etc. So as you could appreciate, we've got 170 SDOs. So here to be able to somehow codify the policy documents and to be able to utilize that information would be really difficult. So for the purpose of this study, where our focus is looking at the impact on the and global sort of value chain, then that probably is going to be a little bit excessive, I think. However, indeed, if you want to particularly look into those areas, which I agree is super intriguing, one would need to isolate particular SDOs where we know better about their policies and we can look at the more meaningful questions. Yeah, that's a really good one. Thanks. I want to, sorry, there is someone, can you see there's someone raising their hands?
No, it's Nick with his hand up. So
okay.
He answered his question already about joining an SDO. So, and we're actually coming to the end of our time, Cher. So
I just sorry, I just want to check if John or Xing has got anything to add to maybe any response.
I really enjoyed the paper. I think it's a great new avenue, and I think there's a lot to be learned from these buyer-supplier linkages that we just don't know, and also business groups and multinationals and where all these things interact. So I think it's a really interesting line of research. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you. I also have my co-author John here as well. I want to check if John has got any final. You want to say a final words?
Well, just first up to say thank you very much to John for the presentation and the cool graphics as well and the helpful suggestions. I mean, the only thing I want to come back on very briefly, with regard to the two-way fixed effects, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a fairly simple methodology, and it is contingent upon basically a homogeneous effects assumption. In the current version, I'm not sure you got this one, we do a test of that, and basically we're not able to reject the null. That said, I'd like to go further on that, so one of the difficulties we have is that because ours is a non-absorbing treatment, so in other words, you can join and then leave. Some of the sort of estimators that have been developed, to deal with this issue, essentially don't, encompass or incorporate or allow for that type of treatment. So it's a little bit tricky, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it is something we want to look at more.
Thanks, John. That's a great way to finish off, and a great discussion underway, I think, about this research. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Our next ESCoE webinar is only in 2 weeks' time, and it's about manufacturing sentiment and capturing that with text analysis with Christopher Kurtz. Sounds really interesting. So we'll see you all then, and no doubt see many of you at the ESCoE conference in May. The registration for that will open in mid-March, so look out for that. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.